Well, hello everybody, and welcome to the third in the series of lectures we had in connection with the Colum Cille anniversary, the 1500th anniversary of Colum Cille's birth, which has been organised for Heritage Week by Donegal County Library and particularly by Una Matheson. So my thanks to them, to the library and to Una for the invitation to speak and for facilitating all the technical details of this. This is the third in a series, and because it's the library that is organising the lectures, we thought it would be appropriate to focus on Colum Cille and books. There are many aspects of the Colum Cille story we could have focused on, but we thought that it would be appropriate in the context of the library to focus on Colum Cille and books. Now, there are many stories about Colum Cille, as I said. In fact, if you go to the National Folklore Collection in UCD in Dublin, in Belfield, there's a huge collection there of folk stories about Colum Cille. And in fact, they say, I've never tested this myself, but I'm told that the largest entry in the card index or the index for the collection is for Colum Cille. And there are Colum Cille stories from all over Ireland. Colum Cille was one of the three patron saints of Ireland in the Middle Ages. And in some ways he was the favourite. He was the kind of one that people felt was nearest to them. But at any rate, an awful lot of the stories that are told about Colum Cille, and including some of the most famous stories and best known stories, are just that. They're just stories. They're legends. They're not factual. They're not kind of drawn from are supported by the sources from history. And I'm afraid one of the stories that's best known about him is his connection with the famous copyright story. And I have to tell you from the outset that this is not history, it's a fiction. But we'll deal with that as we go through the story. Now, I'm using the word history here in a technical sense, and I'm contrasting it with legend. And by history, I mean the reconstruction of past events, whatever they are, based on contemporary documentation. So that's essential for something to be deemed to be historical, that we have contemporary documentation about it. Whereas a legend, and many of the stories about St Columba, for instance, the story of his foundation of Derry, I'm afraid the evidence does not support the foundation of Derry by Colum Cille, and I would be burnt at the stake for saying that in Derry, but it's a legend. In other words, it's a story popularly regarded as historical, but not verifiable. Now, indeed, even the name Colum Cille itself is part of the growth of these stories about him. And there is, as many of you will know, there is a story to explain how he comes to have the name Colum Cille, that he was originally called something like Criffin, and that name meant something close to the name of the fox, the animal, the fox, but by extension meant sly and things like that. And the angels thought that this was not an appropriate name for a saint, so therefore they changed it to Colum Cille. But his name originally was probably some version of Colum, borrowed from Latin into Irish as Colum. And the story about Colum Cille and the various names is part of his growth, the growth of his cult as a saint. Now, just to we remind you of the dates, we have these sets of traditional dates for Colum Cille, born 521, went to Scotland 562, founded Iona, and died in 597. But according to the researches of Dr. Dan McCarthy from Trinity College, we now have these slightly revised. They're not majorly revised, but there are one or two dates that are important. We now think he was born in the year 520, that he went to Scotland in 562, that it wasn't for another year or so that he founded the monastery of Iona in 563, and that he died in 593. And his birth date was the 7th of December, and his death date was the 9th of June, and that's his feast day. And it's that's the tradition in Irish Christianity, that the feast of a saint is the day he died. Confusingly, in Latin, it's also called the Dies Natalis, or literally his birthday, because it was understood as the day that the saint was, as were, reborn into heaven. Now, of course, his most famous monastery was at on Iona, Colum Cille, as it's marked on the map there in Scottish Gaelic. And I mentioned at a previous lecture that one of the things that monks did, Colum Cille himself almost certainly, and certainly his monks, when they went to Iona, they immediately began to record events, write down the things that happened. And these were like the headlines from a newspaper, just simple statements: such and such a battle occurred, such and such a church was founded, such and such a bishop died, or whatever the case may be. But that is the very beginnings of Irish history, and indeed Scottish history. And from that original Iona Chronicle, which does not survive itself, but it survives as if you like, copies of it were made and incorporated in later texts. And these are the various Irish annals that we talk about. Now, in the previous lecture, again, I told you that there were 3 medieval lives, hagiographical lives of St Colum Cille or St Columba. Now, hagiography simply means the writing about holy people or holy things. And it was, again, the tradition, not just in Ireland, across the Christian world, that a saint would be, that there would be a life, a formal life, usually in Latin and certainly in Irish, in Ireland, originally in Latin, but later developing in Irish. So we have these 3 from the Middle Ages, and I mentioned them in a previous lecture. I won't go into them much now, but they are an enormous source for us about, if not exactly the details of the saint's life, then what was believed about him later time. And then we have a number of early poems, a poem that's they called the Evra Colum Cille, that we used to think was composed immediately after his death, but it has now been shown to date to the 9th century. But we do have 2 7th century poems, for Colum and Turin Bechan, and they both date to the mid 7th century, and they tell us about Colum Cille. Now, in the 3 lives I mentioned earlier, the 3 medieval lives, a number of places in Sligo, and particularly Colum Cille's connection with Sligo, are mentioned. Adamnan, in Adamnan's Vita Columbae, he talks about a place called Cúl Dreimhne. In the Middle Irish life, there's a story about the foundation of the monastery of Drumcliff, where Yeats is buried, if a modern association. And then in Manus O'Donnell, he talks about a number of places: Drumcliff, Cúl Dreimhne, Hamlish, and Drumcliff. And these are all part of the story of the copyright incident. And I have there on the map a number of these places: Hamlish, Cúl Dreimhne, Drumcliff, and down below in Sligo, the Drumcliff. Now, we've already talked about manuscripts, but just a little synopsis again. The earliest Irish manuscript we have, the earliest illuminated manuscript we have, is known as the Cathach, and that's the great battle book of the O'Donnells, and it's a copy of the Psalms, and it's not terribly well decorated in terms of when we come to look at the later manuscripts, the Book of Durrow, the Book of Kells, but it is beautifully decorated with very sort of simple designs drawn, as I said before, from the Celtic Latin Iron Age. So these are very early, these are very ancient and almost pre-Christian decorative motifs. And the manuscript was considered as one of the greatest treasures of the northwest of Ireland, and this great jeweled shrine box was made for it in the late 11th century, and it wasn't opened until 1813. In fact, when they opened it, they expected to find the bones of Colum Cille in this, but instead they found a manuscript which by tradition had been written by Colum Cille. And as I said again earlier, in an earlier lecture, we have a number of other very early copies of the Psalms from ancient Ireland. This one is made on wax tablets. It's written on wax tablets rather than on a manuscript, and that's what it looks like. And then we have this very ancient one, which was miraculously retrieved from a bog in County Offaly, the so-called Fattenmore Psalter, which was in the form of, if you like, files, pages inserted into a file, and this was another copy of Psalms. Now, just to go over the Cathach again, because the Cathach is said to have been composed or written by Colum Cille, rather, and it's also the story associated with it's also the manuscript associated with the great copyright story. So just to go over that again, traditionally it was the Cathach is said to have been made by Colum Cille, and certainly it seems to date to about 1600, maybe a little bit before, a little bit after, but roughly speaking, in other words, very shortly after we have the formal date for the death of Colum Cille. It's the oldest surviving Irish illuminated manuscript. It's a copy of the Psalms in a relatively pure, what we call pure Gallican version of St. Jerome's Latin Vulgate. That's of importance just to theologians and people who studied the texts of the Bible. Adamnan says that the last thing that Colum Cille did before he died was copying the Psalms. The Cathach is made up of 58 vellum membranes. Only about half survive, and there may have been a decorated first page. Very often these manuscripts had a highly decorated first page, but that's now lost. And you can see there the size of the pages. It's written in a single hand, in other words, a single person wrote it. With a particular form of black ink, and then with what are called the rubrics or headings in a kind of an orangey red. It's hard to know what the original color was. It's faded now, of course, but probably a red that has faded to orange. It's written in a form of lettering that we call insular majuscule. As somebody described it, the pure milk of Irish calligraphy, and that was written fluently, but without haste. Now there are almost 250 errors in the Cathach, the omission of letters or extra letters, and about half of the errors that have been detected were corrected by the original scribe. There are 65 different decorated initials, and as I said, some of them with this orangey, pinky, reddy color. The design design motifs are drawn from the Latin style. That's a European Celtic Iron Age style, is described. And the book was probably kept in what we call a teague, or a leather satchel. And these satchels, like the child's school bag to some extent, would be hung on the wall, hung on a peg on the wall. Libraries in those days did not have shelves. They had pegs on the wall, and then the satchel containing the manuscript would be hung on the wall. And then, of course, the shrine box was made about 1090. So there you have some of these, the detail of some of those initial letters. Now, one of the most famous stories about St Colum Cille is the Battle of Cúl Dreimhne, in which the background story is that he's supposed to have copied without permission a book. The owner of the book wanted the copy as well, believed he was entitled to the copy. The case was submitted to the High King. The High King gives the famous judgment to every cow its calf, to every book its copy. And that, in other words, the judgment went against Colum Cille, and therefore his family fought a battle over this issue. That's the story in a nutshell. There are subtleties to it. And it's a very favorite story, and people kind of are attached to it. I've never understood why there's so much attachment, because it's slanderous of Colum, it's libelous of Colum Cille. It puts Colum Cille in a very bad light. And so in some way, I always felt a kind of a mission to disprove it. And that's what, to some extent, the conclusions I've come to, which I'm going to talk about further on now. It's a marvelous story, but that's all it is, a piece of fiction. And if you like, the story of the battle and the background to it is a bit like trying to reconstruct the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the Western world from the novels of James Bond. This is a picture of the battle in which Colum Cille is confronting the king, the High King of Ireland. Now, the Battle of Cúl Dreimhne, the story of the Battle of Cúl Dreimhne is a fiction, but the battle itself occurred, and here we have a reference to it, Cúl Dreimhne, in Adamnan's Vita Columbae, written about 700. And he tells us that Hicano secundo post Cúl Dreimhne bellum, that 2 years after the Battle of Cúl Dreimhne, Colum Cille left Ireland and went to Scotland. And here again, he says more or less the same thing, post bellum Cúl Dreimhne. After the Battle of Cúl Dreimhne, Colum Cille leaves Ireland. 2 years after the Battle of Cúl Dreimhne, Colum Cille goes to Scotland, goes ultimately to found Iona. So Adamnan is using it as a dating device in the way that people of my generation used to talk, and the older generation used to talk about the Second World War. They'd say, oh, yeah, after the war this happened, or before the war that such and such occurred. Well, that's the way that Adamnan is using it. He's using it as a dating device. And he simply tells us that the battle occurred and that 2 years afterwards, Adamnan left and went to Scotland. In the 42nd year of his age, Columbus sailed away from Ireland to Britain, wishing to be a pilgrim for Christ. And at the time when the blessed man first sailed away from Ireland to be a pilgrim, 2 years after the Battle of Cúl Dreimhne. Now, the battle is also entered in the Irish annals, but the Irish annals are, as we have them now, the Annals of Ulster is a 15th, 16th century text. The Annals of Tigernach is a 11th and 12th century text. And these are simply copies of copies of copies. So we have to be careful as to what they actually say. For instance, in the Annals of Ulster, there's a number of references to the battle. Just one here for 560, Cathach Cúl Dreimhne, in other words, the Battle of Cúl Dreimhne occurred. And then there's some more, if you like, extended description of it. And I don't want to go into all of that at the moment, but just to say that those later, this is a later description, which is partly fictional and refers to things like the Druid's fence and a magic mist and so on and so forth. There are all sorts of magical aspects to the story. Now, the Battle of Cúl Dreimhne occurred by tradition in the townlands of Cúl Dreimhne, which are just at the foot of Ben Bulba mountain here in Sligo. And as you know, Drumcliff Church is also very close by, a church that at least in later times was dedicated to St Columba, and indeed, as I said earlier, where the poet William Butler Yeats is buried, famous. Now, according to the story, there were 2 reasons why the battle occurred. The judgment by King Diarmid MacCarroll about the copying of a book by Colum Cille, Lagach Buena Bueninus, Lagach Laura Lauron, to every cow's calf and to every book its copy. And secondly, the killing by Diarmid, the High King Diarmid, of a Connacht prince who was under Colum Cille's protection. And in the story, Colum Cille's family go to war over these 2 issues. Now, the story is not found in any early text at all. As I said, Adamnan mentions the Battle of Cúl Dreimhne, and there are some entries in the annals, but the earliest of them dates to the 11th century or so. But the story, the fuller story, occurs in a number of late medieval manuscripts. And by late medieval, we tend to use the 12th century as the dividing. Late medieval is after the 12th century, early medieval is before the 12th century. So there's a kind of when you look at these texts and compare them, there's a kind of an evolution, a literary evolution of the story. And in the text, the Codex Insulensis, formerly called the Codex Insulensis, now in the Bodleian Library in Oxford, it's a 14th century collection of saints' lives. And there is a text called De Causa Peregrinationis Sancti Columba, the cause for Colum Cille's migration or emigration. And that tells the story of the copying of the book, but minus, it does not have the famous judgment by the king to every cow its calf. And then slightly later, from a Donegal manuscript, the Leabhar Cluineamh Suibhne, now in the Royal Irish Academy in Dublin, in the Leabhar Cluineamh Suibhne, there's a text called the Battle of Cúl Dreimhne. And if I remember rightly, that was that particular part of the Leabhar Cluineamh Suibhne was transcribed or copied by a excuse me, by a scribe from Tory Island. And then finally, so I should say that that text contains the copy story plus the judgment, but not as a cause of the battle. And then in the Battle of Colum Cille by Manus O'Donnell, we talked about that great life of Colum Cille written by Manus O'Donnell, finished in 1532. You get the full elaborate story of the copying, the judgment, and the battle, and Colum Cille's departure as a result to Scotland. So if you can see that over a period, over a couple of centuries there, we're getting an expansion of the story, a literary development or evolution of the story. And there we have from the Leabhar Cluineamh Suibhne, that's, as I say, a Donegal book. And here's the judgment of the king. Le gach bo a li, his every cow's calf, is le gach leabhar a leabhar, to every book, its little book or its copy. So that's from the Leabhar Cluineamh Suibhne. And then in Manus O'Donnell's Colum Cille, we have the full expansive story. The whole story is told in the Colum Cille of 1532. And you remember that. Now, here's what it actually says in talking about the Cathach. This is Manus O'Donnell talking about the Cathach. Further, the Cathach, the battle book, is the name of that book through which the battle was fought. It is the greatest treasure of Colum Cille in the territory of St Columba, Donegal. It is covered with silver under gold, that's in the box, and it is not lawful to open it. And if it is taken 3 times right-hand-wise round the host of the Cenedl, the army of Cenedl, when they're going into battle, they will come back safe and triumphant. And it is on the chest of an abbot of an abbot or cleric who, and I love the next bit, who so far as possible is without mortal sin, that the cock should be carried around. And I just have a book here just to, if I can show you. The cock is a book, so it would be, in its box, it would be held on the chest of the cleric and taken in procession around the armies of Donegal, the armies of the Cenedl. Now, the king who's supposed to have given the famous judgment is a man called Diarmaid Mac Chiarall, and we have actually an image of Diarmaid here. This is the cross of the scriptures at Monster. Sorry, actually, that's wrong. It should be at Clonmacnoise, excuse me. That's cross the scriptures at Clonmacnoise. And this is Diarmaid down here, and this is him here. And here he's assisting the saint, Ciaran, to plant, if you like, a piece of wood, which is the foundation of the monastery of Clonmacnoise. So that's whether that, the cross is certainly 9th century, so it's several hundred years after the so-called story. But anyway, it's an early portrait of. Now, we used to think that Diarmaid was a king from the south, well, Meath, Westmeath area, but a piece of work done by the man at the bottom of the screen there, Alva McAvran. Alva died a few years ago, unfortunately, but before he died, he worked out, in fact, that it's very likely that Diarmaid was either from Donegal or was certainly connected closely to Donegal, and in fact that he was a cousin of Columba. There's Columba or Colum Cille, and there's Diarmaid, and they were cousins. according to Alva. Now, the genealogies are very difficult to, substantiate at such an early date, but having said that, it seems very likely that Diarmid and Columba were related. This I won't go into the full thing here, except that in the story, after the battle, and because there were so many people killed in the battle, and Colum Cille himself is supposed to have been there at the battle in the back. In the story, the Archangel Gabriel, no less, leads the, for want of a better word, the Donegal army, and Colum Cille is at the battle. But afterwards, because of that battle, the local saint, Malasha, as it were, tells Colum Cille that he should leave Ireland as a penance and basically never come back. Now, just looking at this map, this is a map of Donegal about 600, so maybe 40 years after the Battle of Cúl Dreimhne. But the two important kingdoms on the map, the yellow is Cenedl, the people of Columba and so on and so forth. And down here, there's another kingdom, the blue, which stretches down into County Sligo, across the Donegal border into Leitrim and on down into Sligo. And they're called the Cenedl. And the longest lasting war, you call it, in this part of Donegal, in this part of Ireland, during all these centuries, from the 5th, 6th century right up to the 12th century, is the conflict between the Donegal kingdom of Cenedl and the Sligo kingdom of Cenedl. We'll see that again, but just to hold that in mind. Just to go back slightly, you can see there, the Cenedl about 600 come right up as far as the church of Racunga, or Racu, which is near Ballantrae. But by 725, Cenedl have pushed them out of South Donegal, south of the Erne, or they're still a bit into what's modern County Donegal, but south of the Erne. So this battle between them goes on, one little bit pushed forward, the other pushes back, and so on. This goes on for several centuries. But that's a really important, the political background to the Battle of Cúl Dreimhne and to the whole story of the copyright. Now, as I said, before the onset of history, that's from about 500 down to the 12th century and later, the principal conflict in this area was the tug of war between the Donegal kingdom of Cenedl and the Sligo kingdom of Cenedl. And the real Battle of Cúl Dreimhne, which is absolutely certain happened, and Adamnan tells us about it, the real battle was almost certainly part of that ongoing war between these two kingdoms, the Donegal kingdom and the Sligo kingdom. And Colum Cille was the principal saint of the Cenedl, and Malasha was the principal saint of Cenedl. So the stories about the conflict between two saints, and Malasha sending Colum Cille off to Scotland as a penance, those stories are really they're really a fictional surrogate for the real political conflict between their respective people. So, if you like, the two saints are used as symbols of the two kingdoms, Colum Cille's people, the Cenedl, and Malasha's people, the Cenedl. And they were real enemies. The two kingdoms were real enemies during all the early medieval period, and the two saints are just used, if you like, symbolically to represent the two kingdoms. That's an early drawing of the very early drawing, one of the oldest drawing of Columba we have. And here's a wonderful statue now in the National Museum of taken from Inishmurray Island in Donegal Bay of Saint Malasha. Now, so the story of the Battle of Cúl Dreimhne, the Battle of the Book, is not history. We have no contemporary evidence which suggests it happened at all. The battle happened, but that has anything to do with a book. No evidence whatsoever. Neither is there any evidence, historical evidence, that Colum Cille had any part in that battle, or that he was involved in it in any way. There is no more evidence that the Colum Cille was present at the battle or scandalously involved in it than there is for the presence and participation of the archangel Michael. The story is classical medieval fiction. Now, people often say, well, it must have happened because the Columban church, the church dedicated to Columba at Drumcliff, is very close to the battle site. And in, you remember yesterday, or at the earlier lecture, I was talking about the Middle Irish life of Columba, written in Derry about 1150, and that shows Columba going off on a tour around Ireland, north of Ireland, and northern half of Ireland, and as he goes, he founds various churches, and that he founded Drumcliff. But that's how, if you like, things were viewed in the 12th century when this life was written. Now, the Middle Irish life, it talks about Colum Cille's the founding Drumcliff Church. And I won't go down through that. That's just the story there. And then it says, and this is really important because this is the important thing, and he left the headship and seniority and succession of that place to Cenil Connell forever. In other words, Cenil Connell are making a political grab of Drumcliff, that Drumcliff is their church. And it was given to them by Colum Cille. Now, this, of course, is, as I say, in a 12th century text. And that's just the foundation story of Drumcliff from the Battle of Cúl Dreimhne by Manus or Donnell. I won't go into that. Now, in an article written many years ago in 2006 by a scholar called Anthony Camden, who now works at the National Museum in Mayo in outside Castlebar, he concluded that the Columban association of the Church of Drumcliff was no earlier than the 8th century. In other words, it may have existed earlier, but if it did exist, it was not connected with the story of Colum Cille, with the foundation of Columba. In fact, in my own thinking, I think it's much later than the 8th century. I think it's probably that the Columban dedication of Drumcliff did not come about till about the year 1000, and I'll explain that as we go forward. Now, early Irish churches were to a very great extent family businesses. Their foundation was in large part an expression of local political loyalties and identity. And in many instances, we can't understand their foundation without reference to the geopolitics of the time. So, you know, in the legends, they tend to be churches and monasteries were founded by saints as a very whole act of holiness. But the reality is that they were founded very much as expressions of local politics, secular politics. Now, as I said, the big conflict in this area, in South Donegal and North Sligo, was between these two kingdoms, Cenil Connell and Cenil Carapra. And I'll just go back. There's Cenil Connell, 600 by 725. They pushed Cenil Carapra south of the Erne. And then a terrible disaster happens to Cenil Connell, which, remember, used to be up here, but they're now defeated in battle by these people, the Inishowen, the Cenil Mogan of Inishowen, and the Cenil Connell are pushed south of Barnsmore Gap, and here they are down south of the Barnsmore Gap, right up against their enemies, the Cenil Carapra, and effectively they've nowhere to move. They can't budge without engaging in major war with all these various kingdoms. The Cenil Carapra is a kingdom that's around about there, but there's evidence that at an earlier stage, in the maybe in the 5th century, it extended right across Ireland. There are little pockets of Cenil Carapra kingdoms in County Longford and right down County Meath, County Kildare, and there may have been a much bigger Cenil Carapra kingdom stretching right across the south of the north of Ireland in early times. But by the time we pick up the story in the 560s and later, the Cenil Carapra are confined to North Sligo. There's exactly. And that was, I mentioned in an earlier lecture that the St Colum Cille's people, their original capital place was at what's now called Croghanhill, just close to Lifford. And from there, then they spread out in all directions. And we can see them pushing right down here. All these are all battles that they fought, and pushing right down to the Erne and indeed further south. Now we know that the Erne, they pushed the Kenil Carpus south of the Erne, and that at the time of the writing of another text called the Vita Tripartita, the Tripartite Life of St Patrick, the Erne was still their border. And here's another text, the Baha Adamnon, the Life of Adamnon, written in 950. The Erne, the Kenil Connell and Kenil Carapra meet for a parley, and they do it at Sarow, in other words, at the Erne. So the Erne is still their border. And but everything changes in the year 1000. Donegal king called Mulrooney O'Mulderry becomes king, and he's highly aggressive, and he fights a number of battles with the Kenil Carapra. We have various references to where he's at. I stuck for time, so I'm just going to skip through this a little bit. But all of these dates, 1006, down to 1011. In the year 1011, Brian Boru comes up from County Clare, and he goes to Mockcurran, and Mockcurran is in Mockcurran is in North Sligo, and he arrests, if you like, or captures Mulrooney and Mulderry there. So in other words, Mulrooney has now crossed over into North Sligo and taken control of that area. And then again, in 1011, there's another battle, and the Flaherty, the King of Aileach, led an army into Kenil Connell as far as Drumcliff and Yochla or Ballysadare, and they inflicted a defeat on Mulrooney. So in other words, we see here that this guy Mulrooney and Mulderry comes to power in the year 1000, and immediately he starts pushing right down into Sligo and captures that territory. And then he goes off on a pilgrimage to Rome in the year 1026, and on his pilgrimage to Rome, he goes by way of Colum Cille, that's Iona. In other words, he's making a kind of a statement that he's going to Iona because Iona was founded by Colum Cille, and Colum Cille is one of his people, one of the and then we have some other connections with the O'Mulderry family and Iona at a later stage. So this is Drumcliff as it looks now. From the air, mind you, there's a new big car park here, which isn't shown in this photograph. And here we have the round tower of the monastery, and the main road from Sligo to Donegal, or vice versa, goes right through the middle of the ancient monastery. The ancient monastery would have spread something like that. But very significantly, there is a high cross, and this is the high cross. And there are disputes about the date of the cross. I myself think it dates to about 1000 AD. In other words, shortly after Mulderry crosses down into Sligo, he erects this cross as a memorial, and because this cross is very definitely a Columban cross. And the reason I can tell you that is because, just first of all, Peter Harbison, who's a great scholar on High Cross, he said that he didn't see any parallel for the head of the cross in Ireland. I think it's not exactly identical, but I think it's very close to here, St. Martin's Cross on Iona. But that's not the main reason. The main reason is because on St. Martin's Cross, at the center, and I mentioned this before, there is a depiction of the Virgin and Child. And the Virgin and Child, very common in later Renaissance art, but very scarce in early medieval art. But it's almost a Columban brand. It's on all sorts of crosses and in the manuscripts. And here we have it at about the year 800 on Iona, and it occurs Uniquely in Ireland, there's no other depiction of it in Ireland, but on the side, this is the south transept of the cross, and on that edge, it's around the corner, there it is, the depiction of the mother and child. So whenever this cross was erected, this is almost certainly telling us that the church is a Columban church. And there we have it's on St. Martin's cross, there it is on St. Oran's cross in Iona, there it is in the Book of Kells. These are all Columban monuments and manuscripts. And just to add to that, there's a marvelous poem, or a hymn actually, from Iona, written by a man called Cúl Dreimhne of Iona, who died in the year 740. I'll sing to a couple of lines here. Cantemus in omni die, continentes variae, conclementes Deo dignum, hymnum Sanctae Mariae. It's a two-part hymn in honor of the Virgin Mary. So I mentioned earlier in an earlier lecture that the Columban churches, monasteries, had great devotion to Mary, particularly Mary as the mother, and Mary as the mother of the world, and so on. And this is just part of that. So to sum up the story of the Battle of Cúl Dreimhne and the copyright battle and so on and so forth, we can say that Adamnan, writing about the year 700, tells us that Colum Cille went to Scotland 2 years after the Battle of Cúl Dreimhne. He does not say or suggest in any way that Colum Cille had any role in the battle. He's using it only as a dating device. There is no evidence that Colum Cille had any connection with the battle. The Cathach, which people tell us is the manuscript that was copied, the Cathach is roughly the right date to have been written by St. Colum Cille. But his authorship cannot be proven, or for that matter, disproven. It's simply a matter of date. The Battle of Cúl Dreimhne was almost certainly fought, the original real battle, which is mentioned in the text, between the Ceiniol Conaill and Ceiniol Carabra. The latter won, that's Ceiniol Carabra, won the battle and invaded South Donegal. But in the centuries following that, they were pushed out again, and it was kind of a tug of war as one gained the upper hand. But eventually the Ceiniol Conaill, the kingdom of Ceiniol Conaill, pushed Ceiniol Carabra out of South Donegal as far south as the Erne. And in the 11th century, the Ceiniol Conaill pushed them further south again, right down south, even south of Sligo, what's now Sligo town. When the Ceiniol Conaill took over that area of North Donegal, about the year 1000, they rededicated St. Malasha's church at Drumcliff. The church at Drumcliff had possibly been founded by Malasha as the principal church of the Ceiniol Carabra, but it was certainly dedicated to him. But the Ceiniol Conaill, when they took over about the year 1000, they rededicate the church to St. Cille, St Columba. And the cross with the Virgin and Child image on it may be, and certainly is, the earliest evidence we have for that. So the story of the copyright, it's a marvelous story, marvelous piece of medieval literature, but it is not history. It is 16th century fiction, not 6th century fact. So Colum Cille can be exonerated from all responsibility for the fictional deaths that occurred in the Battle of Cúl Dreimhne. So I'll leave it at that. I hope you enjoyed these lectures and that I didn't make things too complicated. Thank you very much for your attention.